The first Athens Defence Summit, couldn't be more timely. Europe is at a crossroads. What's certain is that the defence structures that have guaranteed our security for decades have never looked shakier. What isn't certain is what replaces them. That is a question that everybody at this summit and in capitals across Europe is currently grappling with. Thankfully for us, help is at hand in picking a way forward. General Sir Nick Carter, for those who don't know him, is a distinguished former soldier with a career that spanned over 4 decades and several conflicts. He served in Northern Ireland, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq. As the former Chief of the Defence Staff, the head of the armed forces in the UK, he was one of the first to publicly raise the alarm about Russia's actions in the grey zone. He now advises governments on defence and national security, a subject he is considered a thought leader, and he somehow managed to be name-checked on this stage yesterday before he'd even arrived. We're delighted he's here to talk to us. He has recently written a paper which was presented at the Munich Security Conference on the 5 tests for European leaders on security and agency. Nick, perhaps you could just sort of set some of those out for us. Talk us through your ideas.
No, thank you for those kind words of introduction, and good afternoon. Yes, I'm going to lay some challenges down for European leaders during the course of the next quarter of an hour to 20 minutes or so. But I'm going to start from a quote by the much-quoted Italian Marxist philosopher Antonio Gramsci. And while he was imprisoned by Mussolini's fascist regime in 1926, he wrote a series of notes and essays, later published as prison notebooks. He also introduced ideas like the role of intellectuals, not just academics, but anyone who shapes how people think. He distinguished between wars of position versus wars of maneuver, very topical in today's conflicts. And he saw civil society as a battleground. So schools, media, and religion were key sites of power. But what's been quoted a lot about him recently is the observation he made in the 1930s in his prison notes. I quote, "The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old world is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear." Some have paraphrased this to monsters more recently. Either way, I think most of us would agree that there are strong parallels with present times. The fundamental assumptions that we Europeans have believed for generations have been upended permanently. No longer are we living in a world where a rules-based order assures the control of supply chains and maritime choke points, enabling us to focus on economic efficiency. The new world is one based on spheres of influence, in which we are obliged to focus on more costly national resilience. And this has been brought sharply into focus by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. As that great Greek thinker Thucydides put it all those years ago, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. And in the light of this, we Europeans should be concerned. For our deterrence architecture, which for over half a century has been based on American extended nuclear deterrence and forward deployments, underpinned by Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, is now extremely fragile. President Trump's challenge to us to spend more on our own defense was timely, as was the commitment to 3.5% of GDP at last year's NATO conference. But with the announcement of US troop withdrawals from Europe, and with Trump's ambiguity over the definition of Article 5, what confidence can we still have that the US has our backs? Now, despite all this, European armed forces have been slow to adapt, even in the face of Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine. Instead, the primary focus has been on filling shortfalls that existed prior to the outbreak of the war. Europe thus remains vulnerable, and this vulnerability has been further exposed by the publication in December of the US National Security Strategy. This has shifted to a focus on the Western Hemisphere, with an underlying focus on China that may reassure allies such as South Korea or Japan, depending on its execution in practice, but that leaves Europe in the cold, as evidenced, I would suggest, by US behavior and actions. Over the past year, multiple rounds of US-Russian negotiations about Ukraine have been held in both Saudi and Alaska without European or Ukrainian presence. Last summer, European leaders tacitly accepted the imposition of 15% of trade tariffs on their exports to the US. The Trump administration has threatened the territorial sovereignty of Greenland and Canada. And of course, the national security strategy openly discusses intervening in Europe's domestic politics to ensure, I quote, patriotic parties come to power and preventing, I quote, civilizational erasure. It would therefore be optimistic to assume that come 2028, even with a more Atlanticist US president in power, that there will be a return to the status quo pre-Trump. So, just as President Zelensky began to do 6 weeks ago, it is time for European leaders to stop pretending. The US may not be able to be a reliable ally any longer. We should assume that we are on our own. And then, of course, there's the threat. It's normally measured in terms of capability and intention. On the latter, who knows how an increasingly paranoid Putin might behave? And on the former, their capability is improving. Russia has continued to diversify its nuclear arsenal in an arms race with the US that is slowly but steadily building up. Although this modernization has been slow, particularly in the development of non-strategic systems, Russia's progress has been in the qualitative and quantitative improvement in delivery systems through a suite of missiles and unmanned underwater vehicles. According to a variety of assessments from intelligence agencies and think tanks, the Russian armed forces are likely to be in an improved rather than a degraded position by 2030. The reactivation of the Lenin military district in response to Finland joining NATO and the stationing of more than 5 land divisions within it has greatly strengthened Russia's western borders with NATO. And very few of the 150,000 conscripts that are mustered each year are being used in the war in Ukraine. Russia's forces will have modern high-tech defense industry supplying them, a wealth of direct experience and lessons from sustained high-intensity theatre-level warfare, attributes that NATO forces do not possess. Even though its losses in Ukraine are considerable, a reconstituted Russia will be able to pose a credible military threat to European forces. Europe, therefore, needs to actively shape a new defense deterrence architecture, having relied on the United States for too long. The tasks now facing European leaders can be understood through 5 tests, all of which I suggest need to be tackled simultaneously. First, can Europe sustain Ukraine's ability to fight and force a settlement on favorable terms? Second, can Europe impose clear and credible costs for Russian sabotage, subversion, and aggression? Third, can Europe rebuild credible deterrence by boosting readiness, scaling industry, and delivering capability faster within a new, relevant way of warfare? Can Europe redefine the social contract with its populations by rebuilding public understanding, resilience, and support for security? And fifth, can Europe rewire its security decision-making for these new circumstances? So I'll start with Ukraine. Ukraine's ability to defend itself and shape any future settlement is central to Europe's long-term security. The outcome of the war will define Europe's strategic environment for a generation. As the war continues, Europe faces sustained capability, fiscal, and troop constraints, alongside growing pressure to accept an unfavorable settlement. Continued US support is no longer guaranteed, so shaping the outcome of the war will require Europe to act with greater clarity, scale, and resolve. European support has been substantial, but uneven. Incremental escalation rather than strategy, short-term funding cycles, fragmented supply chains, and limited industrial capacity restrict Ukraine's ability to plan and sustain operations, weakening European leverage over the course of the war. The test for European leaders is whether they are prepared to provide predictable multi-year support and whether they are willing to exercise the political and economic boldness required to sustain it. This includes readiness to mobilize military effort at scale and to take decisive action across economic and legal domains, including the use of frozen Russian state assets. The unlocking of the €90 billion loan recently is a step in the right direction, but it only gives Ukraine macroeconomic headroom until next spring. The clear objective is that we should ensure Ukraine can continue to defend itself and enter any settlement on terms that strengthen both its own security and Europe's. For that outcome to endure, any settlement must be sufficiently credible for Europe's future security to alter Russia's strategic calculus, making a different post-war relationship possible rather than entrenching the belief that further gains can be pursued through either force or coercion. That's how I would define victory. The second test is whether Europe can impose clear and credible costs on Russian sabotage, subversion, and aggression. Russia is conducting a sustained campaign against Europe that extends well beyond the war against Ukraine and is designed to undermine our support for Ukraine. It includes sabotage, cyber attacks, disinformation, subversion, and political interference, and increasingly overt military probing and aerial incursions into NATO airspace. These actions are not isolated incidents, but form a continuous campaign below the threshold of armed conflict and below courtroom standards of proof. They stoke conspiracy theories and speculation to cover their tracks. They target energy systems, undersea pipelines, cables, logistic hubs, and so on and so forth. As the US think tank, the Center for European Policy Analysis, pointed out recently, I quote, "Russian operations are fast, deniable, and iterative. Western responses are slow, deliberative, and consensus-bound. Delay blunts the impact of anything we do, and we are, of course, crippled by fear of escalation. And existing frameworks, including NATO's Article 5, were designed for a different era and are poorly suited to deal with this. We need to call these attacks out for what they are, rather than hiding behind ephemeral terms like a grey zone or hybrid warfare. If it's sabotage, let's call it that, so our populations know what's happening. We need to think laterally and asymmetrically. Instead of playing tit for tat with the Kremlin, we should blindside them with the scale, variety, and sources of our responses. As Ed Lucas put it recently in the Times newspaper, we must work as allies because teamwork flummoxes Kremlin decision-makers as they have no real allies. A sabotage attack on one country should lead to a coordinated sub-threshold response with maybe a money laundering investigation in one jurisdiction, an unseaworthy ship impounded in a second, a cyber attack on a Russian-related target in a third. We've done this well in the past. Remember the coordinated response to the attempted GRU assassination of the Skripal family in the city of Salisbury in the UK in 2018. The response was the expulsion of 153 Russian diplomats and intelligence officers from more than 20 allied countries. This nefarious campaign will continue until European leaders find the gumption to start imposing costs on the Kremlin. Now, the third test, which I suspect is the one that most people are focused on, is can Europe rebuild credible deterrence by boosting our readiness, scaling industry, and delivering capability faster within, importantly, a new relevant way of warfare. European forces face significant shortfalls, and fixing them remains, I'm afraid, a work in progress. Across the continent, forces still remain structured to generate for out-of-area operations, reminiscent of a time when it was acceptable to cannibalize from other units to allow at most a single national brigade to deploy. This focus on readiness to deploy for a mission far from Europe's borders has left many militaries severely short of personnel, equipment, and stockpiles. Europe's ability to take responsibility for its own defence, protect its strategic interests, and re-establish deterrence will ultimately depend on whether it can generate real military capability at scale and speed that adversaries believe European leaders are willing and able to use. Now, although defence spending is rising sharply, particularly in Germany, Europe has persistently failed to convert resources into military power. Addressing this requires a fundamental rethink of how European defence functions, from planning to procurement to delivery. Europe's procurement systems remain shaped by peacetime bureaucracy, prioritising national economic imperatives over interoperability, process over speed, and small numbers of expensive, exquisite systems over scalable mass. This approach constrains production, weakens supply chains, limits readiness, and suppresses industrial competition and innovation, particularly in areas where capabilities evolved on much shorter innovation cycles than legacy systems, where regrettably too much of the new money is being directed. In the near term, Europe will continue to rely on US systems where European alternatives don't yet exist. I fear this is an unavoidable risk. Many systems ordered today will not be delivered for years and will lock in new dependencies, all of which, of course, is exacerbated by the US consumption on the war in the Middle East. At the same time, uncoordinated national procurement risks duplication and missed opportunities to build European scale and industrial depth. Without changing how capacity is generated, not just what is bought, higher spending will continue to deliver weak returns, wasting taxpayers' funds, undermining public support, delivering poor capability to our armed forces, and all of that too late. This requires rethinking Europe's defence architecture to reward speed and agility, prioritizing software-defined hardware, and optimizing capabilities over time rather than focusing on one-off procurement cycles. This is much more Helsing than Rheinmetall. Europe must pursue immediate procurement and long-term industrial investment in parallel. Priorities would include European air and missile defence, ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, long-range missiles to give us escalation options, recce strike drones, the integration of digital and AI-enabled systems across platforms and in decision support, and robotics and autonomy to create scalable mass. But it also, I suggest, requires a new military strategy. We have an opportunity, given our particular geography and clear need to grow our military capability, to develop a way of warfare that suits us. We don't have to be slaves to a US-led multi-domain operations concept, which I doubt we can afford and might not work for us anyway. Long-range attack systems fighting a deep battle with some form of drone-equipped porcupine defense in the close battle on the borders might be more effective than mobile maneuver forces that would be unlikely to arrive in time. We Europeans have a golden opportunity to establish a new way of warfare, and we should seize it. The fourth test: can we redefine the social contract with our populations by rebuilding public understanding, resilience, and support for security? The reality is that if political leaders are to turn commitments into real action, they must be able to sustain public support for increased defence spending amid economic pressures and competing priorities. Without public backing, neither higher spending nor institutional reform will endure. And of course, public attitudes vary widely across the continent. Polling suggests that only around a third of European citizens overall are willing to fight for their country, with levels ranging from 45% in Poland to, say, 14% in Italy, underlining the scale of the political challenge. We must redefine that social contract, and our politicians must be prepared to make hard choices, explain their costs, and prove through action that defence is inseparable from Europe's economic and social foundations. And the final test: can Europe rewire its security decision-making for these new circumstances? I have used the term European throughout this talk. This could be taken to mean collective action by the European Union or non-US members of NATO within the structures of those organizations. I've taken it to mean a more flexible shorthand to refer to coalitions of European states, regardless of whether it is in the context of a European pillar within NATO, as part of the EU's common foreign and security policy, or even a coalition of the willing. Establishing a more independent European posture, though, requires first and foremost an explicit political decision to move away from American dependency. Instead of muddling through and responding to the whims of American leaders. This shift towards greater independence in defending Europe from Russia will not be easy politically, financially, or militarily. But our security environment is moving faster than our political systems. Threats are persistent, cross-border, and often ambiguous. Yet the institutions and processes designed to manage them remain slow and fragmented. This is not about creating new institutions or duplicating NATO's role. It's about changing how decisions are taken, about how authority is exercised, and how delivery is driven across existing European and transatlantic structures, so that priorities can be aligned and action taken quickly. In the context of strengthening the support for Ukraine, I suggest that coordination among the E3 in London, Paris, and Berlin, supported by the key roles played by Warsaw and Rome, has demonstrated how shared ambition, clearer leadership, and tighter coordination can accelerate delivery and translate intent into action. But such formats will succeed only if they are embedded into a more durable framework, without which momentum will fragment and delivery will fall short. The test is whether Europe can take binding security decisions and begin implementation within days rather than months when crises emerge. This means the rapid formation of coalitions of the willing, clear political leadership by a small number of states, and immediate mobilization of diplomatic, economic, and military tools without prolonged procedural delay. To conclude, without changes to how decisions are made and enforced, Europe's ambitions will continue to outpace its capacity. In today's environment, power is exercised by those who can decide on, mobilize, and sustain action quickly. Europe's political systems must be reshaped to meet that reality. European leaders cannot afford to fail. At stake is not only Europe's security, but its agency, and a way of life that stems from a civilization that has been at the heart of global development for thousands of years. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks for that. The cheat sheet to your paper, which is still available online should you want the whole thing. You talked there about a new way of warfare, a new European way of fighting. Just talk us through what that looks like.
To begin with, I just need to sort of paint the alternative. The United States is remarkable in terms of the scale and capacity of its defense capability. And it has multiple services because they include others than just simply the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force as services. And each of those services has extraordinary resources and the ability to adopt modern technology at pace, subject to their procurement and acquisition systems. But they also have a remarkable ambition to link all of this together and to integrate together the domains of space, information, cyber, land, air, and maritime. And they will be able to do it because they've got the resources and the wherewithal to do it. They would, of course, like their allies to adopt a similar way of thinking about a way of warfare. The reality, of course, is that I doubt in Europe we'll be able to afford that. I also doubt that we need something that essentially is going to be quite generic and in many ways is designed for the sort of fight that the United States might have in the Asia-Pacific area. So my view is that we should look at our particular geography, our borders with Russia in the Baltic states, or indeed in the Nordics, or indeed further south, and we should consider what technologies and ways of fighting might best deter Russia, impose cost on Russia should she choose to invade, but equally then how we deal with that once it occurs. And what I think we're learning from the way that modern technology is supporting warfare is that relatively cheap technology, like drones, like hand-mounted anti-tank weapon systems, can have a huge impact. And we see that in Ukraine, and we saw it particularly actually in the early days of the war, where anti-tank systems did this. Now, if you can use systems like that on your borders, you will make it very prickly, hence the porcupine analogy. But equally, you need to have longer range strike capability to be able to get at uncommitted forces that potentially will be the second echelon that will follow the first echelon of the invasion. And that's where we need to get into long-range attack systems, missiles, drones, and the like. Now, none of that is massively expensive. That's what's interesting about it. And what's also interesting about it is it can be delivered relatively quickly. So many countries at the moment are buying traditional capabilities that are going to take 5 to 7 years to arrive, even if we've got the industrial capacity sped up to deliver those sorts of things. And particularly when you consider a lot are going to be bought from the United States, when actually the United States is going to have to reconstitute itself in the light of the amount of munitions and air defense interceptors that she's used over the course of the last 10 weeks or so of the war with Iran. So my assessment is we need a European way of warfare that is particular to our geography and particular to the threats that we face, which is not generic and is not massively expensive and is not massively ambitious, like the Americans will put on the table.
Which presumably means buying more European.
I mean, I think to begin with, we have to accept we may obviously continue to have to buy some American stuff, but what we really want to do is to develop our own very good high-tech industries in Europe to be able to deliver these sorts of capabilities.
And in terms of thinking about what it is that governments buy, you posited a really interesting idea there about finding a cost for some of the actions that we see in what has been called the grey zone, whether it's sabotage or perhaps if it's a cyber attack. We've never really had a very good response to those things because of plausible deniability, not really knowing how to calibrate a response. You talked about potential options there that we could try and exercise. Should we be thinking about the entire spectrum, though, not just the grey zone, beyond? Do we have enough rungs on the ladder of escalation when we're thinking about how to respond to Russia?
Straight answer is no. I mean, people, I'm sure, in the audience will have watched Yes, Prime Minister all those years ago, and that memorable clip of Jim Hacker, who was the Prime Minister, being challenged by a defence expert on when he would press the button. And of course, this programme was out before the Cold War came to an end, so the Berlin Wall was still very much a feature of the geography. And he was asked whether if the fire broke out in West Berlin and the East German Fire Brigade came across, he would press the button. Of course, he said no. And you can imagine how the scenario ratcheted up until the Soviet armies were at the doors to Calais. And he was then asked again whether he would press the button. Of course, he said no. So the point is that you've got to have a ladder of escalatory responses from, if you like, the sub-threshold all the way up to just below that nuclear threshold. And I think we know that in Europe we don't have many rungs in our ladder. We've always depended upon American rungs in the ladder, and that's particularly the case when it comes to tactical missiles and those sorts of capabilities, which frankly would bother, as we saw, I think, on Mr. Putin's face Saturday a week ago at the Victory Parade, would bother him. And that's the sort of thing that we need to be able to have in our inventory.
For those of you who didn't understand the reference, I'd highly recommend Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister. Alexander Stubb said he learned everything he knows about politics from it. So it's still very current. It's a very funny British programme, but I can't recommend it enough. You've been talking a lot about the threat of Russia, which I think is seen differently across Europe. How big a threat is that right now? You know, there's a lot of debate about how urgent a threat it is. Can we afford to wait until 2030? When do we need to start worrying about what Russia might be up to?
I mean, I think, a lot of people believe that Russia is fixed in Ukraine and that as a consequence of that, Russia is unlikely to have the capability to be able to do anything in parallel with Ukraine. I personally don't subscribe to that view because, as I said in my remarks, they are building capability outside the war in Ukraine. They have not committed much of their Air Force or their Navy, and particularly their undersea capability, obviously. And of course, the reality is that in terms of their resources, in terms of soldiers and human beings, they mobilize around 150,000 conscripts every year, which don't get used, in theory, on the battlefield in Ukraine. So they've got capability. The threat, of course, though, is always measured in terms of intention and capability. And I think the bigger question is what is in Mr. Putin's mind. And I think that what we are hearing, whether it's true or not, but what we are hearing, I think, maybe we're being too optimistic here, is that Mr. Putin is becoming increasingly paranoid. And as he becomes more paranoid, of course, that might make him perhaps more reckless, because he wants to bring his country together and to unite it and whatever else. So I think if you combine the capability that I've described with the potential intention that might be there, personally, I think we need to be ready before 2030. And that's going to be a challenge.
You talked about the need for Europe to support Ukraine as the first step in order to keep Russia off our borders. How should Europe go about doing that? And is it possible, you set out an idea of what victory for Ukraine would look like in your speech. Is it possible for Ukraine to get to that end state without more American help?
I mean, I think we should be in no doubt that America is still providing Ukraine with really important intelligence and targeting information. And the extraordinary campaign that the Ukrainians are waging on the Russian oil industry at the moment is evidence of that, where they're not just going after refineries, they've worked out how to target some of the key elements of the overall system. And they're doing it at remarkable ranges, out to sort of 1,500 kilometers from their own border, hence Moscow being threatened, if you like. So the answer is that, they very much depend upon American intelligence, and, we must keep our fingers crossed that that remains the case, that it remains available. I think without that, I think we should be clear now that although American weaponry is finding its way to Ukraine, it's being bought by Europeans and given to the Ukrainians, because that's the system that the Trump administration has now put in place. And I think that's entirely understandable, and I think Europe needs to step up to the plate to make sure that the money keeps flowing to continue to acquire those sorts of capabilities. But we should also not lose sight of the fact that Ukraine's innovation is remarkable, and they are finding workarounds for the less American capability that's not coming into Ukraine at the moment. And I think that, again, that requires investment. And I think we, as Europeans, should be conscious of what we could probably derive from Ukraine and Ukraine's experience, and indeed their remarkable defense industry, which is beginning to deliver stuff that is much more affordable and, frankly, works.
You pointed out in your speech that many of the talks about Ukraine's future are being conducted without Ukraine and without Europe. If Europe is propping up the Ukrainian side, can they win, whatever winning looks like, without Europe finding an ability to be at the table?
Well, that's why I'm afraid all the 5 tests that I've put on the table this morning or this afternoon, those 5 tests have to be answered together, because you can't have a serious conversation with Russia as Europe unless you have got in your locker the sort of capability that makes Russia respect you. And of course, it's vital, if the United States is standing back or is going to impose maybe outcomes on Ukraine that Ukraine doesn't want, that Europe is able to fill those shoes and to negotiate much more evenly with Russia than perhaps Russia might believe at the moment. So I think, we've got to step up and look resilient and tough and all the things I've been suggesting in order, frankly, to be able to coerce Putin to negotiate in good faith.
You pointed out a number of reasons why America right now looks like a less reliable partner, and apologies to our American friends in the audience, but having already offended them, I think we may as well go the whole hog. Is Europe, as a concept, is that sort of a reliable substitute? We had Franz Timmermans on this stage yesterday saying it's actually in a great position now with Hungary having had a change of government. It seems less divided than it has in the past, whereas others might point out that Hungary is looking like a stable partner because it has come out the other end of what could be described as the fever dream of populist strongman government. But a lot of other countries across Europe right now seem to be one election away from trying the same experiment. How do you replace one flawed concept of collective defense with something that is durable, whatever happens with different governments and whether they have a change of values and ideas?
Yes, and I think I'll just slightly pick you up on one flawed system, because I think, to be fair to NATO, it's lasted for more than 75 years now and has been...
But it's coming a cropper. It's
got challenges that it needs to resolve. I wouldn't call it flawed, but it's got challenges it needs to resolve. I mean, the answer is it's a very fair question. At the end of the day, these alliances are essentially political alliances, and they are essentially populated by the leadership that their countries elect. And we should be concerned about that in many ways. I think we've seen the rise of right-wing populism throughout Europe, and that right-wing populism tends to be a bit more tolerant of Russia's behaviour than perhaps other types of political background might have. So yeah, I think we should be concerned about it. But I think that's why reasonable, sensible people need to be speaking out and saying, come on, this is a threat regardless of how you might perceive it.
But how do you plan for a collective defence, knowing about those vulnerabilities? Do you find ways of working around it? Is it, when you're buying, for example, is it just interoperability you're thinking of, or would you rely on every European partner being a part of any potential?
Well, that's why, towards the end of my remarks, I delved a bit into what's meant by Europe. And I think that, European leadership at the moment seems to come from the E3, so Europe, France and Germany, supported by Rome and, of course, by Warsaw, which are the other big players in all of this. And I think that, most smaller countries in Europe tend to get in behind them, stand fast where Hungary's been and maybe Slovakia is at the moment. So I think that, a smaller coalition of the bigger countries nonetheless still remains a feasible way of dealing with the problems. Now, all five of the countries I've mentioned have their challenges when it comes to the politics of this. But I would have thought at the moment the five leaders of those governments are probably more or less united in understanding what the problem is. Now, whether they're prepared to solve it in the same way remains to be seen. The issues of national interest when it comes to defence industries, I'm afraid, are alive and well. And that's why we see challenges with the German-French FCAS programme, for example. It's hard to suppress your national interests for the greater good when it comes to, the economics at home. But that apart, I think that in terms of the problem set, those countries probably see it in the same way.
Well, that's just a flavour of some of the questions that I'm sure will be brought up in many of the other sessions here. Again, do have a look at General Sinead Carter's paper, still available online, on the 5 tests for European security and agency. But thank you very much for sharing those thoughts with us.
Thank you.